The house on the corner of a quiet street looked serene. As if frozen in eternity, it stood under the shade of trees whose branches swayed in the gentle breeze. But inside this cozy shell, there was something more, a tension invisible to the outside world. Margaret sat by the window, watching the sun slowly sink below the horizon, painting the sky in pastel shades of pink and gold. Her hand clutched a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. She wasn't even aware that she was staring at something specific. Her gaze was focused on the void, and that void echoed in her chest. She had grown accustomed to loneliness. It had become her silent companion, embracing her so tightly that escape seemed impossible. The divorce had long since faded into the past, as had the passions that once tore her apart. Now her days were filled with trivial concerns. Organizing shelves, reading books she never planned to finish, and hours spent in front of the television. But lately, something had changed. A small crack had run through her serene shell. She felt it the moment she saw the drops of water steadily falling from the faucet in the kitchen. It was just a leak, minor and seemingly insignificant. But for some reason, it became the catalyst that drove Margaret to act. She picked up her phone, found the number of a local handyman, and dialed it without a second thought. It was a decision that probably wouldn't change her life, but it set off a chain of events she couldn't yet foresee. The next day, when the doorbell rang, she felt a strange excitement. Her breath quickened, though she didn't know why. She opened the door and froze. Standing before her was a young man with a confident smile. Tall, with muscular arms clutching a toolbox, he looked like he belonged to another world. A world where people lived without fear of emotions and desires. "Did you call for a handyman?" His voice was deep and calm, like an autumn evening, but there was something else in it that made her heart flutter. Margaret nodded, stepping back to let him into the house. She felt the tension filling the space between them, like an invisible electric field. He introduced himself as Jacob, and for some reason, that name echoed strangely in her memory, as if she already knew him. As he leaned over the sink, Margaret realized she couldn't take her eyes off him. His movements were confident and precise, yet there was a strange softness to them that drew her in. She stood in the corner of the kitchen, watching him, feeling the air around her grow thicker. "Looks like a simple problem," he said, looking up and meeting her gaze. His eyes lingered on her face for a moment, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. Her voice betrayed her as she replied, "Good. Thank you." It was just a small exchange, but it left her with a strange feeling. When Jacob left, she couldn't stop thinking about the way he had looked at her. That gaze was too long, too meaningful to be accidental. That night, she lay in bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, her thoughts wandered, returning to him. His voice, his touch on the pipes of the sink, which she felt as if it were touching her. And though it seemed silly, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life would never be the same. But she didn't know that this chance encounter held more than she could imagine. It was the beginning of a story that would turn her world upside down. A week had passed since Jacob's visit, but his image lingered in Margaret's mind. She often caught herself unconsciously searching for his gaze in a crowd or wondering what it would be like to hear his voice again. She tried to convince herself that it was just a fleeting infatuation, silly and momentary, but memories of that day kept resurfacing, like old photographs in an album that couldn't be closed. The evening was quiet, as usual. Margaret sat in the kitchen, trying to focus on a book, but her thoughts kept slipping away. When the phone rang, her fingers instinctively trembled. An unknown number. Her heart raced as she picked up the receiver. "Hello? Margaret? It's Jacob. I wanted to check if everything is okay with the sink." His voice was like a warm breeze after the rain. She felt a warmth spread through her chest and forced herself to respond calmly, "Yes, everything is fine. Thank you for asking." There was a pause on the other end of the line. It seemed like he wanted to say something but changed his mind. Finally, he broke the silence. "If there's anything else, just let me know. I'm always around." Those words, simple and mundane, somehow carried more weight. Margaret felt an invisible thread tighten between them. "Of course. Thank you, Jacob." When the call ended, she sat for a long time, holding the phone in her hands. Her thoughts raced, trying to understand why the conversation had affected her so much. Maybe it was just his voice, its softness and attention, or maybe it was something more. The next day, Margaret couldn't hold back any longer. Her gaze kept falling on the sink, and the thought of calling Jacob again seemed increasingly tempting. It was reckless and silly, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to do something. Just another small thing, she told herself. Just a small thing that needs fixing. She dialed his number, and Jacob's voice came alive in her ears again. Margaret? His tone was slightly surprised, but not dismissive. Jacob, hi. I seem to have another small problem. Could you come over? It's probably nothing, but I'm not sure. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Her heart raced as she waited for his response. Finally, he said, Of course, I can come over. When is convenient for you? Today, she suggested, feeling her voice betray her with a slight tremble. Tonight. I'll be there in an hour. She hung up the phone and caught herself smiling. A sense of anticipation gripped her, both frightening and exhilarating. She knew she was walking a thin line, but she couldn't stop herself. Evening descended on the city, wrapping its streets in the soft glow of streetlights. Margaret stood before the mirror, fixing her hair, though there was no need. She rarely made such an effort. The thought kept spinning in her head. Why am I so nervous? But the answer was obvious, even if she was afraid to admit it to herself. The doorbell rang unexpectedly loudly, making her jump. She approached the door, her heart pounding faster than it should. Jacob stood on the threshold, his presence seeming to fill the space around him. Good evening, he said with a slight smile. What happened this time? Margaret stepped back, letting him in. She felt the air between them charged with that same tension that made her lose her bearings. She led him to the bathroom, where the faucet was slightly dripping. It's probably nothing, she said, feeling her voice tremble, but I thought it best to check. Jacob nodded, crouching down in front of the sink. His hands confidently reached for the tools, and Margaret couldn't take her eyes off his movements. She tried to distract herself, but every gesture, every sound drew her attention. How was your day? He suddenly asked, not looking up. It caught her off guard, but she quickly composed herself. Just a regular day. Nothing special. And yours? Jacob chuckled. There were a few calls, but nothing interesting. He looked up, and their eyes met. But now I'm here. Margaret felt her breath catch. There was something more in those words than just friendliness. She wanted to respond, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she looked down, feeling her cheeks flush. Looks like I'm done, he said after a few minutes. His voice brought her back to reality. The faucet isn't leaking anymore. Thank you, she replied, meeting his gaze. But deep down, she knew the tension between them hadn't dissipated. It had only intensified. Jacob lingered in the hallway, gathering his tools. Margaret watched him, trying not to show the excitement that was growing within her. She couldn't bring herself to speak first, but the silence became unbearable. Do you often work this late? She finally asked, her voice sounding unexpectedly loud. He looked up and smiled. Sometimes. Some clients have urgent matters. His gaze was soft but attentive. And you? Late evening. The perfect time for reading or reflection? Margaret couldn't help but smile. I suppose for both. Sometimes I think the silence in the house is too loud. Jacob nodded as if he understood her words more deeply than he should. I know that feeling. Sometimes work is just a way to drown out that silence. Their conversation was punctuated by short pauses filled with something that didn't need words. Finally, Margaret took a step closer, her voice softer. Are you always this attentive to people? Jacob looked at her, and a spark flashed in his eyes. Not to everyone, he replied, then added with a slight smile. But I think you already know that. Margaret felt her heart beat faster. This moment seemed to hang in the air, like a thin line between caution and inevitability. She took another step closer, and Jacob didn't back away. Would you like to stay for tea? Her invitation was almost a whisper, but it carried so much strength that refusal seemed impossible. Jacob hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. If you don't mind, he replied. Their conversation continued in the kitchen, becoming more personal. They talked about life, work, and the coincidences that had brought them to this moment. But no words could hide the tension that grew between them with each passing minute. Margaret felt, for the first time in a long time, not lonely, but alive. The evening was in full swing. In the kitchen, there was a cozy silence, broken only by the sound of cups as Jacob and Margaret sat at the table. The light from the lamp softly illuminated their faces, adding a sense of intimacy. "I haven't had evenings like this in a long time," Margaret confessed, leaning on the table. Her gaze was fixed on Jacob. "Usually, my evenings are spent in solitude." He nodded, looking away as if he wanted to say something but hesitated. "Sometimes solitude is beneficial," he said, "but it seems like you deserve more." Her heart skipped a beat at those words. Was it just a friendly remark? Or was there something more behind them? "You're very attentive, Jacob," she said softly. "But isn't it hard, always being like this?" He smiled, looking at her. "It's just my nature. I try to see something good in people. In you, it was easy to notice." Margaret felt her face flush. She wanted to say something in response, but Jacob continued. "Sometimes we meet people who change us, even if they don't realize it. You are one of those encounters for me." Jacob's words sounded sincere, without any pretense. Their eyes met, and at that moment, all the tension that had been building between them reached its peak. "Why do you say that?" she whispered, trying to make sense of her feelings. "Because it's true," he replied, leaning slightly closer. "And I think you feel it too." Margaret held her breath. At that moment, it seemed like the whole world had shrunk to the space between them. She felt a wave of emotions rising within her, emotions she had suppressed for too long. "You're right," she finally admitted. "I feel it too. But I don't know where this can lead us." Jacob smiled, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "Sometimes it's worth just letting go and seeing what happens." Their faces were just inches apart, but neither of them dared to make the final move. The room was filled with a deep silence, broken only by their breathing. Margaret realized that this moment was more than just an attraction. It was a turning point from which there would be no return. "Jacob," she whispered, not breaking eye contact, "I'm afraid." He looked at her, his gaze full of understanding. "I am too," he confessed, "but I want to be with you." Those words sounded like a promise. And though they both knew that many challenges lay ahead, this moment was real, alive, and inevitable. The sound of rain outside the window muffled the silence that filled the house. Margaret sat in her living room, looking at the lamp, whose warm light spread through the room. Her thoughts were filled with memories of Jacob, of his smile, of how his voice filled her home with life. These were moments that seemed both real and ephemeral. The doorbell rang. Margaret's heart tightened. She wasn't expecting anyone at this hour, but her intuition told her it was Jacob. She slowly rose, her legs feeling like cotton, and taking a deep breath, she opened the door. Jacob stood in the rain, his hair wet, his face tense. But in his eyes, there was determination. "Are you okay?" she asked, trying to compose herself amid the wave of emotions that washed over her. He hesitated, as if he didn't know how to find the words. "We need to talk." She silently stepped aside, letting him in. His presence filled the room, and the tension between them became almost palpable. Jacob sat on the couch, leaning his elbows on his knees, and was silent for a moment. Margaret sat across from him, her gaze filled with anticipation. "I can't stop thinking about you," he finally said, his voice soft but firm. "It's wrong, but I can't do anything about it." Jacob's words broke through her defenses. She felt tears welling up in her eyes and looked down, trying to hide her emotions. "I can't either," she whispered. "But what can we do about it? We're too different. Our lives, they don't intersect the way we'd like them to." Jacob looked up, his gaze filled with pain and desire. "It doesn't matter. What I feel for you is the only thing that matters right now." He came closer, kneeling in front of her, and took her hands in his. The warmth of his touch was soothing, but his gaze was a storm of emotions. "I don't know what will happen next," he continued, "but I know I don't want to lose you. You've given me more than I could have imagined. You've shown me that life is not just about work, not just about routine. You've given me meaning." Margaret felt her heart melt. She raised her hands and gently ran her fingers through his hair, brushing away the raindrops. "You've changed my life, Jacob. I feel alive again. But I'm afraid this is just temporary. That one day you'll realize we're too different." "It doesn't matter," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I'm here because I want to be with you. Because you mean more to me than anything else." They sat in silence for a long time, their gazes saying more than words ever could. And in that moment, Margaret realized that despite her fears and doubts, she couldn't push him away. She had lived in the shadow of her emotions for too long, and Jacob had become the light she couldn't ignore. "Stay," she said softly. "Just stay close." He nodded, and they embraced, allowing the moment to fill the space around them. It was more than just a connection between two people. It was an intertwining of their destinies that had now become inevitable. And though they didn't know what lay ahead, they decided to face it together. Outside the window, the rain gradually subsided, leaving behind a sense of freshness and new beginnings. And in the house, filled with light and warmth, two souls found a home in each other.